for this exploration of Chopin's life and work and all the tangled relationships that tell his story. An incredibly packed history in those last 3 years of his life, 1847 to 49. And you already know that this is the breakup with George Sand, and that precipitates really his final decline and the end of his composing. There were no more masterpieces coming month after month after this breakup. He was broken. He was sad and depressed and utterly broken by it, and his health was in a serious decline. She had always been in complete denial about his health. She figured it was psychological, that he was some kind of hypochondriac, and that she had the power, through her faithfulness and her passion and her loyalty, to cure him if he would just come to his senses and get with the program. But he never did. He just kept getting sick repeatedly every winter, and sicker and sicker and sicker. And I think she got fed up with it. And then, besides her giving up her life, an act of martyrdom on the altar of his genius, she had teenage children. And that was where the real difficulties came. Maurice was now in his early 20s, and she was grooming him to be the man of the house and to take over the estate of Nohant and run the estate and make the decisions about hiring and firing and how money was spent. Maurice had always been very jealous and resentful of Chopin. And since about 1845, when Chopin was all of 35 years old, he had been treated like an elderly relative who's disabled and needs help. And so you put up with them being in the house, but you really ignore them all the time. They're just there, but it's kind of in the way. So that was Maurice. But it became more intense as he got older, and he was ready to push Chopin out. So he fired his Polish manservant, which was a petty and cruel thing to do, because Chopin had nobody to speak Polish with, and this man had been with him for a long time, and he was loyal. He was maybe, yes, a little slow and a little dull, but he was a nice servant, good companion, and Chopin had the pleasure of speaking Polish with him. So Maurice fired him, sent him away. Then Solange, the daughter. Remember, Solange is the illegitimate daughter of George Sand and has been treated like the unwanted child her entire life. She was always sent to boarding schools where Maurice was homeschooled. She was kept in boarding school in the summers, even summer vacation, when Maurice was brought back to Nohant for beautiful summers in the country. And she always called her by nicknames which clearly showed her that she was the illegitimate child. Solange grew up resentful, starved for her mother's love, jealous of her brother, intensely jealous of the mother-son bond, and found a sympathetic friend in Chopin who was kind to her, gave her piano lessons, and allowed himself to be interrupted by her whenever she ran in with something wanting attention or wanting to spend time or wanting comfort. He was there for her. He was just being kind. Ultimately, George Sand became jealous of this relationship with this child that she didn't even want and had no love for. And as the girl matured, it became more and more problematic. So now imagine, this girl is 17 years old, and Mama has kind of arranged a marriage for her with a very nice young man, upstanding family in the village in Nohant where they live. And everything's going along fine. And they are approached by this somewhat notorious sculptor of low repute from Paris, Auguste Clésanger. And he wants to do portraits of the mother and the daughter. But what's really happening is he's a fortune hunter. He has huge debts. He drinks. He regularly beats up his pregnant mistress. He doesn't have work. And he submitted a really scandalous sculpture to the Salon of 1847, which was Woman Bitten by a Serpent, which was made with a live casting of a woman who was the muse of Baudelaire, this Apollonie Sidonnet. And it was a huge scandal. And people said, this is not even sculpture. Delacroix at least gave him the benefit of the doubt and said, well, what's the difference between that sculpture and a daguerreotype, right? They're both images from life that are just altered slightly, polished up. So he was invited to Nohant by Sand, and there's a possibility that she was interested in him herself. She was very flattered by the attention. They had multiple sittings. And then he goes after the daughter. And this made Sand probably turn against him. He seduces the daughter, who's engaged, meanwhile, to this nice boy from the local town. He seduces Solange. She dumps her fiancé, gets pregnant. And now there has to be a rushed wedding to get this done quickly. And Sand wants to conceal it all from Chopin because she knows he'll just be upset and he will be opposed to it, as were all her friends, all her associates. All said, no, how can you do this? How can you do this to your daughter? This man is no good. He's just trouble, and he's just fortune hunting. So I have some letters, some spectacular letters to show you regarding keeping everything secret from Chopin. She's writing to a close friend. Tell Chopin what you think is best about us. I dare not write him myself for fear of upsetting him. I fear he'll hate the idea of Solange's marriage, and that every time I mention it, he'll suffer an unpleasant shock. I cannot make Chopin the head of my family and its counselor. My children would not accept such a situation, and my personal dignity would be lost. Okay, so she rationalizes, and then she talks about Chopin. For a long time, the disease which gnaws at the body and soul of this poor creature has been the death of me. And I see him fading away without ever being able to do him any good. Since it is his anxious, jealous, and touching affection for me which is the main cause of his misery. In other words, he's making himself sick. For the last 7 years, I've lived like a virgin with him and other men, but even so, it cost me no sacrifice, for I was so weary of passions and hopeless disillusionments. If ever a woman on earth should have inspired him with absolute confidence, I was that woman. Oh, man. So she's clinging to her belief that Chopin's illnesses are psychologically induced. Then the wedding happens. It's rushed. There's no wedding reception. Nobody's invited. It's just a rush. Get this done quickly because Solange is pregnant. And there was a scene. Solange and Clézange came back to Nohant, and he immediately proposed that Sand should get a huge mortgage on Nohant so that they would have a big monthly income and could live in style in Paris the way they expected, in the level and the style they expected to live. And Solange, of course, said, no. Are you crazy? No. And there was a dinner. Fortunately, Chopin was already in Paris when this happened. This is irresistible to read the whole thing because it's like a scene from a soap opera or from one of her novels. She reported to Marie de Rosières, who's a pianist who was a sometime student of Chopin and a friend, a mutual friend. So this is from Sand's mouth. There has nearly been murder here. My son-in-law, that's Clézange, took a hammer and would have perhaps killed Maurice if I hadn't thrown myself between them, punching him in the face and receiving from him a blow in the chest. If the village priest who was there and some friends and a servant hadn't intervened by force, Maurice, armed with a pistol, would have shot him then and there. And there stood Solange, stirring the flames with icy ferocity, after having caused these dreadful, dreadful outrages by her tales, her lies, and incredibly filthy stories. This pair of devils left yesterday. I never want to see them again, and they will never set foot in this house. I had to give Chopin a partial account of all this. I was afraid he might arrive in the middle of a catastrophe and die of grief and shock. Please don't tell him the worst of what happened. We must hide it from him, if at all possible. Solange, ever the genius manipulative creature that she is, when she was thrown out of the house, they went to the village inn, and she sent a message to Chopin saying, "I'm ill." He didn't know she was pregnant. I mean, she's pregnant. She's been thrown out of her mother's house. They have no money. And the journey by stagecoach from Blois will exhaust me. It's a 30-hour stagecoach ride from Sand's country house to Paris. Can you lend me your carriage to return to Paris? Chopin had left a carriage at Nohant, and she wants permission to borrow it. Please send reply at once. Before I can leave, I shall await your reply. I'm in a most embarrassing position here. I left Nohant forever, after my mother made the most frightful scenes. Please wait for me before you leave Paris. I simply must see you at once. They positively refused to let me have your carriage. So if you wish me to have the use of it, send a note giving permission, and I'll send it to Nohant so as to obtain the carriage. He did. He always supported her in a quiet, sympathetic way. He writes back, Chopin to Solange, I am most grieved to hear that you are unwell. I hasten to put my carriage at your disposal, and have written to your mother to that effect. Do look after yourself. Your old friend, Chopin. Well, when George Sand found out that he had supported Solange and given his carriage, she took it as the final act of war. She used this as the excuse to make the final break. How could he side with her? She's the enemy. So, now aware of pregnancy, on July 24th, Chopin writes his last letter to Georges Sand. I'm not called upon to discuss Mr. Clésanger with you. His very name did not become familiar in my mind until you gave him your daughter. As for her, I cannot remain indifferent to her. You will remember that I used to intercede with you for both your children, without preference. I did this whenever I had the chance, being certain that it is your destiny to love them always, for those are the only affections which are not subject to change. Ill fortune may cast a shadow over them, but cannot alter their nature. This misfortune must be very powerful today, if it can forbid your heart to listen to any mention of your daughter, at the beginning of her life as a woman, at the very moment when her physical condition calls more than ever for a mother's care. When faced with such a grave reality involving your most sacred affections, I must pass over in silence that which concerns me personally. Time will do its work. I shall wait. Still the same as ever, yours most devotedly, Chopin. Well, my regards to Maurice. If that isn't the soul of diplomacy. But she reacted, she exploded. Maybe this was just the excuse she'd been waiting for. So she writes back a much longer letter. I won't read the whole thing, but it's painful. She blames him for everything, her role, her dignity, she's an outraged mother, and her authority and everything has been challenged. I have had enough of being a dupe and a victim. I forgive you. And from now on, I shall not utter one word of reproach. For you have made a sincere confession. It surprises me somewhat, but if, having made it, you feel freer and easier in your mind, I shall not suffer from this strange turnabout. Adieu, my friend. May you soon recover from all your ills. I hope you will now. I have reasons for thinking so. And I shall thank God for this queer end to 9 years of exclusive friendship. Let me hear now and then how you are. There's no point in ever discussing the other matters. Nor did Chopin ever try or write to her again. That was the end. Oh my God. So painful, so dramatic, and him kept in the dark much of the time. Now, let's look at some quick pictures of where this all happened so you can have a little context. This photo is the only actual photo we have of him. It's probably from 1847. It's not a daguerreotype. It is a photo, and his face is already terribly swollen with the neuralgia and the edema and the effects, the advanced effects of his illness. Okay, let's keep going. He had left Nohant before all this disasters happened. Oh, there's a healthy-looking portrait. Very nice one. Also 47. Kind, thoughtful face. He was in Paris at the apartments in the Square d'Orléans. Let's go on. Where they had apartments there for about 7 years, and where he had had his students coming. Oh, this is wonderful. This is a recent computer-generated images by someone who works in movies, who has all that very advanced technology they use to create, special effects and things, digital effects. They use the death mask and various portraits to create this incredibly lifelike portrait of Chopin. Not a really beautifully handsome man, but an extremely thoughtful, sensitive face. I find this one really fascinating. Okay, and he was small. Remember, he was short of stature, and he weighed about 100 pounds. Their apartments in Paris were in the most exclusive district, in the 9th arrondissement. And the apartment building was the Square d'Orléans, which was known as the New Athens because of the number of very accomplished people, artistic people who were living there. Let's keep going. There's an exterior view and a plan of the apartments. If you ever visit Paris again, if we're ever traveling again, this brass plaque shows the plan of the apartments. Chopin was in number 9, and down in the lower left-hand corner. That was a very small apartment, and his rent was only about 600 francs a year. Sand was in number 5, kitty-cornered across the courtyard. There's this nice interior courtyard with a fountain and trees, and much bigger, much bigger. Her rent was more like 3,000 something francs per year. So they could visit. He could teach in number 9, and then, if they had a dinner party or if we were spending time together, he would walk across the courtyard to number 5. As well, it was perfect for all his countesses and his marquises who arrived in their carriages. Next picture shows the entrance to that interior courtyard where people would have gone through with their carriages and let off Princess this and Marquise that and Countess XYZ at those doors. And then you go in the doors to number 9, which are on the left, and just go up a very short flight of stairs, and you're right at Chopin's apartment. So this was very perfect for both the students and for Chopin. He didn't have many stairs to climb. Next one shows the interior courtyard. So it was private, and there were lots of famous people living there, artists, musicians, ballerinas, actresses, all kinds, and some other pianists as well. So it was a lovely enclave of high-toned artistic types. Okay, next one. Someone made a drawing of his salon with his grand piano, the Pleyel, of course, where the students came and left the 20 francs on the mantle. He never touched the money, and they never put it in his hand. He just never wanted to touch it. So they just discreetly left it on the mantle and came and went. And most of the princesses would have had about a 45-minute lesson, maybe an hour. But if it was a more advanced student, it could be several hours, could be a whole afternoon. Next image shows a photo of Solange and one of the drawings of her by Auguste Clézange, made that horrible year when she broke the engagement and got pregnant with him. She just looks like trouble. I see insolence, I see sullen, I see willing to use sexual power to achieve what she thinks she wants. This girl was a serious trouble. And of course the marriage didn't last. The child that she was pregnant with died within a few days. She got pregnant again, and that child lived for a few years and then died, and then he left her. So there are no surviving children, and she had to make her own way, which she tried to do by writing fiction like her mother. Okay, next slide shows a picture of him. There is an actual photo of him, and you can see what a brute. I'm not surprised that he beat up his pregnant mistress and got drunk and left debts all over Europe. He had to leave Florence because he had debts. His father would have nothing to do with him because he'd bailed him out too many times. And now he's looking for money, and he thought, well, George Sand is the richest, most famous woman in Europe. I'll either get her or get the daughter. One of them will be my ticket. And this scandalous sculpture he did for the Salon of 1847, The Woman Bitten by a Snake, made from a life casting of a woman. And the scandal was that people knew who the woman was. They actually recognized her. So they thought, this is just too sordid and too horrible. And what are we going to see next year? Is it going to be Solange's little behind on a pedestal at the next salon? So he was not a positive influence. I would like to go back and play some music for you. There was music still going on at this point. Chopin's health was bad and he was in decline, but he was still writing music. He was also dealing with publishers himself. His dear friend Julian Fontana had gone to America, and he had to deal with multiple publishers, England, France, and Germany, because there were no international copyright laws. So in order to maximize his income from the compositions, which was essential, especially when he was ill and couldn't teach, he had to make sure the timing was that the pieces would come out at exactly the same time in England, Paris, and in the Germanies because of piracy. People would just copy them and sell them. So I have some letters from Breitkopf and Herschel's representative in Paris. This is Mr. Heinrich Probst, who dealt with Chopin for a number of years. And he has some comments starting from before Majorca with the preludes, after Majorca, and then a little bit later. Welcome, Herr Probst. Would you like to join me?
Be happy to. May 2nd, 1838. Chopin's 24 preludes, 1,000 francs. Second ballade, 500 francs. 4 mazurkas, 300 francs, can be regarded as settled. On Chopin, I have some quite favorable opinions that he will long shine as a new genius. September 11th, 1838. Today I mailed via Schlesinger 1 packet included the unfortunately very expensive, frightfully extended 3 waltzes by Chopin that he scribbled only for travel money. Chopin has gone to Palma on the island Majorca. February 12th, 1839. Yesterday I finally had a rendezvous with Chopin. He has 7 manuscripts finished and demands 3,500 francs in return. He is certain you will take the works at any price. He was too arrogant, said he was sick, indeed looked terrible. Since he could give no lessons, his works must therefore give him support. The works themselves, from which he has played me quite a bit, are still gloomier than the earlier ones. They are not grateful to play. The sonata is clever, but dreary and baroque throughout. The remaining works are scribbled down morsels of the well-known type, such as you already have better. My advice is to let him go without losing careful sight of him.
So you see what he had to deal with. But he did. He juggled them. He was getting paid more than any other pianist composer at the time, and he knew he could demand those prices. Now, the sonata they're talking about is the B-flat minor sonata with the funeral march. So yes, that is a gloomy piece. But there were some other preludes and waltzes and mazurkas in minor keys, a gloomy piece. And there's a beautiful prelude, Opus 45. I would like to play this prelude for you, the Opus 45 prelude. It's later than the preludes that he wrote in Majorca. It was after they came back. And what's fabulous about this piece is it's a beautiful piece. It has a long cantilena melodic line. But the connection to Bach jumped out at me. The longer I played it, the more I saw the connection to Bach. Okay, so first let me play you the opening of the Bach prelude in C sharp minor from Book 1, of the Well-Tempered Clavier. I'll just play the very opening and pay attention to about the first 5 or 6 notes. Here's the Bach. Now, the very opening of this prelude has that theme embedded in the alto voice. And the main theme itself takes those 3 notes, the 3 notes with the appoggiatura, and he expands that into the theme of this prelude. And this prelude is a nocturne type piece. You'll hear it. Okay, so listen for those tiny elements borrowed from the Bach prelude. This is quite gorgeous, and it's not much played. I don't know why. It's beautiful. I can tell you that when Sviatoslav Richter made his debut at the age of 19, he played 2 works by Chopin on the program. One was this one, and the other was the F minor ballade. So if he thought it was good, it was good. fabulous piece. And you would never guess that all that Bach thematic material was embedded in it. But he loved Bach, and he loved the well-tempered clavier. Okay, now, the breakup. You saw the Square d'Orléans apartments. Paris erupted in riots. Chopin played a concert in February. It was his last concert in Paris. And he played the cello sonata and a Mozart trio and a few pieces, including the barcarolle. And there, a second concert was planned, but he had not the strength to follow through with it. And Paris erupted. And there's a wonderful description by Berlioz, who saw how terrible things were there. Everybody left town. I mean, everyone even who had money left because the situation was so unstable and so dangerous. So a lot of them went to London. Here's Berlioz, appalled by what he saw. What a sight. What hideous ruins. The fallen trees, 4,000 trees were cut down. The crumbling houses, the squares, the streets, the quays still seem quivering with the murderous struggle. Fancy thinking of art at such a period of wild folly and bloody orgies. All the theaters are closed. All the artists are ruined. All the teachers are idle. Poor pianists play sonatas in the squares. Historical painters sweep the streets. Architects are mixing mortar on the public works. The Assembly has just voted fairly considerable sums towards the opening of the theaters, and in addition has granted some slight relief to the more unfortunate among the artists. But how inadequate to meet the wants, especially of musicians. It was desperate. So at this time, a Scottish student of Chopin's, Jane Stirling, entered and took up the role that formerly Sand had, and that was of kind of caretaker, manager, arranger of concerts and touring and taking care of details for him. She had been his student since about 1843. She was a spinster. She was exactly the same age as Sand, 6 years older than Chopin. And she traveled with her older sister, Mrs. Erskine, who was a widow. They were very wealthy. And I have some pictures of her and her play il piano and their home in Scotland. And she became essential to Chopin in these next few months. She became known as Chopin's widow. There were rumors that there was going to be a marriage, but that was no chance that was going to happen. He was absolutely not interested in it and had no energy and knew he was ill. But she was so devoted. So there's her play il piano at her home in Scotland. Okay, and next one, you can see how wealthy they were. Her father had huge estates, and they owned sugar cane plantations in Jamaica. And that was the source of the principal wealth. That's Kippenross House, and a little portrait of Jane and her father when she was a child. Okay, next one. There's another drawing of Jane, a nice one, with her cousin. And Solange left a very generous description of her in her memoirs, because Solange was around sometimes for the piano lessons. During lesson times at the master's house, one would often come across two long persons, I think she means tall, of Scottish origin and size, thin, pale, ageless, solemn, dressed in black, never smiling. Under this rather lugubrious surface were concealed two lofty, generous, and devoted hearts. The one who took lessons was called Miss Stirling, and the other lady accompanying her was her sister, Mrs. Erskine. Okay, Jane suggests, let's go on, next one, that they leave Paris and go to London. And she can arrange concerts, she can arrange lessons, everybody is there already. He'll be able to take up his career exactly as it had been in Paris before this revolution of 48 happened. So he went, she convinced him, and she was going to take care of everything. So that's a house near Edinburgh where he stayed for 3 weeks. And I have some of his travel notes. He wrote back to Polish friends in France. He was pretty miserable. I mean, he was sick. None of these people spoke Polish. They spoke poor French, and he did not speak English. I mean, other than good morning and thank you, those kinds of things. He did not speak English. So it was very difficult, and he felt completely isolated. Also in London, the attitude towards musician was that musicians are kind of hired help. They weren't seen as artists. They were in the way they are in France and Germany and Russia, music as a holy art. It was like music as a commodity that you buy for furnishing a house or for furnishing a party. In London, Chopin found himself for the first time in his life in a society which commonly regarded musicians as just another kind of hired help, helpful for dishing out background music while the regular domestics serve the food. The London Times also didn't like him, and they took exception. They would not cover any of his concerts. They wouldn't mention anything. He did manage to play for an event where Queen Victoria was there, but she just wrote down, there were some pianists playing. She didn't even mention him by name. This was not what he expected at all. The English are so different from the French, whom I have become attached to just as if they were my own people. The English consider everything in terms of money. They love art because it's a luxury. They're good and kind souls, but so eccentric that I quite understand that if I stayed here, I myself could become petrified or turned into a machine. Later, it's horrible. I'm unwell and depressed, and my hosts simply weary me with their excessive attentions. I can neither breathe nor work. Although I'm surrounded by people, I feel alone, alone, alone. All those with whom I was in most intimate harmony have died or left me. All that remains to me is a long nose and a fourth finger out of practice. I feel neither grief nor joy. My emotions are completely exhausted. I'm just vegetating and waiting for it all to end quickly. I haven't a decent musical idea in my head. I'm out of my rut like a donkey at a fancy dress ball. This was a hard trip. It was exhausting. They scheduled social visits every day, sometimes multiple social visits. And he's sick. They had one actual scheduled concert in Manchester, which was covered by the press and was attended by a few hundred people. And Chopin, remember, he takes opium. He takes gum water for his cough. And when they were in Mallorca, he had hallucinations, and he continued to use opium. It was the standard medicine. It was cough syrup in those days. And he had to get up and leave the stage while he was playing the funeral march. This is what he wrote to Solange a few days after the concert. A strange thing happened to me while I was playing my sonata in B-flat minor before some English friends. I had played the first movement and the scherzo more or less correctly. I was about to tack the funeral march when suddenly I saw arising from the body of my piano those cursed creatures which had appeared to me one night in Mallorca. I had to leave the stage for a moment to pull myself together, after which I continued without saying anything. I think this is an opium hallucination. So I would like to play for you the funeral march, the sad and gloomy funeral march from the B-flat minor sonata that Herr Probst thought was so gloomy and miserable that nobody would buy this piece. But it is probably the most famous piece that is recognized all over the world by people who aren't musicians. Everybody knows the funeral march of Chopin. And it was actually played at his funeral, arranged for orchestra. So here is the Marche funèbre from the B-flat minor sonata. The trip to England didn't end well. He was gone for between 7 and 8 months. Long, long trip. At the end, he was sicker than ever. Sick as a dog, he said, more dead than alive. As soon as I'd finished, I came home. But I couldn't sleep all night. I had an awful headache, in addition to my cough and choking spasms. I had already been ill for 2.5 weeks. And he's still getting dragged around. Too ill to write these last few days. Finally, he wrote to Solange to let her know he was coming back. Tomorrow, I return to Paris, scarcely able to crawl, and weaker than you've ever seen me. The London doctors urged me to go. I can neither breathe nor sleep. The climate here is inconceivable for people in my state. So I'm going back to lie whimpering at the Place d'Orléans while hoping for better times. Chopin. So he returned back, and he had to be carried up the stairs to that apartment, and it was winter, and he was sick, just sick, endlessly sick. Friends came and took care of him. Jane Stirling came back and took care of him. In the spring, he was moved to a nicer apartment in a kind of a sunny location out in the country, and the rent was subsidized by friends, wealthy friends. And then in September, the final move back to the most exclusive address in Paris at Place Vendôme, in a building that had been the Russian embassy, a very, very fancy apartment, again, all subsidized by friends. He moved in September. It was carried up to his bed, and he never left it. There were a lot of people around in those final days. His sister came from Warsaw and stayed for weeks and weeks to look after him, and that was a good thing, because when he died, he had no will. And there was a suitcase full of manuscripts and letters. He had ordered that all the manuscripts be burned, and they were terrified that if the Russians got hold of the letters, that many of their Polish friends would be at risk of being arrested, because they were always looking for connections to the uprising of 1830 or any further political activity of the Polish government in exile. And he was connected to all those people. So his sister and Julian Fontana came back, and she collected all the manuscripts, a huge load of them. And instead of burning them, they saved them, and Julian edited them, and they were published posthumously. And those are some of the most famous pieces, like the Fantasy Impromptu, and some of the most famous waltzes, and the final mazurka, which I'd like to play for you. This is, he wrote almost nothing in those last couple of years, but there is this mazurka, which is quite stunning. At the end, it says, da capo senza fine. That means repeat without ending. It just keeps going around and around and around. There's no ending. So the convention is that you end at the end of this A section, but there's some beautiful chromatic harmony in there, including one measure that sounds exactly like the theme from Tristan. It has the famous Tristan chord. Wagner, which is going to be much later, but of course Wagner was very influenced by Chopin, as was Liszt. Liszt, I think, was jealous his whole life of Chopin's style of being able to write. He could outplay Chopin in certain areas of technique, simply because Chopin was a physically weak specimen of a man compared to him. But Chopin had by far the greater gift and the greater subtlety. So Liszt learned, even Brahms, and on to the French Impressionists, especially Debussy. Debussy was obsessed with Chopin, and Ravel, and the whole Russian school. So this little mazurka has the Tristan chord. I'll play that one bar for you before I play the whole piece. And in the end, at the end of the B section, there's a canon. It's very short. But again, the homage, the orientation to Bach and to counterpoint, which is lifelong, the careful writing of inner voices, which contrapuntally no one did better, except maybe Mozart. Mozart and Chopin are the masters of counterpoint in this classical romantic style. So the little mazurka in F minor, it's a very pale, thin, feeble thing, but it has little sparks of genius. So first I'll play the Tristan chord for you. Again. I know you all recognize that. All right, so here we go. Written in 1849. So touching. And he said, "Where is my art? Where I have not a musical idea in my head." He had no strength, no energy to do anything. His death and his funeral are very well documented. I have some pictures. The anniversary of his death has just passed us, October 17th. He died at 2 a.m., surrounded by his sister and very close friends. And a portrait, the next picture, was commissioned by Jane Stirling from a Polish painter friend of him. And the people in the portrait were all there. That's his sister on the left, sitting in the chair. There was another Polish friend who was not welcome. It was a guy who was a priest. And for about 6 hours, he kept forcing Chopin to kiss relics and tried to get him confess. Now, Chopin's family were religious Polish Catholics, but he had never once set foot in a church. He was not a practicing Catholic, but this guy just persisted and persisted until finally Chopin went through and allowed him to do the last rites. The woman standing holding his hands is the Princess Czartoryski. She is the wife of Adam, who was the head of the Polish government in exile. She was an excellent pianist and a student of his, one of his most brilliant students, who, however, of course, because she was a princess, was never going to teach or play in public or have any kind of a career. So Chopin's legacy as a teacher died. He was very unlucky, and his students, they all died, or they were all aristocrats with titles and women there was no idea of a career ever. The man in the chair is Zimawa, his other Polish friend, who was the banker, ex-military man who supported him, who George Sand wrote the 40-page letters to at the beginning of their relationship and always looked on him as an advisor. And then the man standing to the far right with his head bowed is the painter himself. Jane Stirling was a little disappointed to find herself not in the picture. As you can imagine, she paid for this picture. She was supporting Chopin, and she paid mostly for the funeral. Let's keep going. Clesinger, the jerk. Oh, this is one more picture by the same painter. Did a quick sketch that morning after he died, had sketched him on his deathbed, and I'm struck by the chestnut blonde hair. You always think of him as kind of a dark person, but he was very, very pale. Okay, next one. Clesinger Auguste, our sculptor, rushed in. He couldn't wait for Chopin to die, did a death mask and a cast of his hands, and was already at work on a funerary monument because there was a committee assembled to decide what to do because there had to be some kind of a monument, and the commission was over 4,000 francs, so it was a very big prize. Okay, next slide is his hand, his left hand, which has fascinated pianists forever. Long, supple, long, thin fingers, perfect for getting around quickly in and out of the black keys. All right, next one. The Church of the Madeleine in Paris is where the funeral was held. This is a Greek temple of a church, immense. 3,000 people attended when they were there by invitation. There was a full orchestra from the Paris Conservatoire that played the Mozart Requiem with soloists. And it took 2 weeks to get this arranged because there was a rule that women could not sing in the church. So they negotiated, and finally they agreed, okay, you can have the soprano and the alto soloist if they're behind a curtain. So Pauline Viardot and the other soloist had to be behind a black curtain so they could be heard but not seen. And the orchestra played the whole Mozart Requiem, which was very expensive. And the organist played 2 of the preludes, the B minor and the E minor, and then the funeral march was also played. And then this whole huge crowd went in silence, walking through the streets of Paris to Père Lachaise cemetery, where he was buried, with no ceremony. No word, no spoken words, no rituals, no nothing, just the interment of the body. Next picture, I have that grave. And of course, that is now a tourist site in Père Lachaise. And there is the monument made by Auguste Clesinger. And it's a weeping muse with a lyre in her lap. And then the profile of Chopin on the pedestal. I think Chopin really detested this man. And he also hated Chopin. But he knew there was a very fat commission if he could win this contract, and he was already ready with designs, so he won the contract. And ironically, there's his statue on top of the grave. Chopin's heart was removed at his request and taken by his sister Ludwika in a crystal container sealed with wax back to Poland. Next picture, we've got the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw. They entombed, at first it was just entombed in the crypt, and then a few years later somebody found it and said, oh, this doesn't seem right. And so they entombed it in a column in the church with a very big plaque there. But interesting, during World War II, that church was completely bombed and destroyed. Next picture. And the Nazis came, and like they stole everything, they stole Wanda Landowska's pianos and all the art everywhere, and they took Chopin's heart. And so it was gone during the war and then brought back in 1945. And they made a very big processional deal out of this. So this procession is not in Warsaw, but at Żelazowa Wola, his birthplace, little village. And so they visited there and then was finally re-entombed in the column in the church. So that is also a big tourist site. Next picture, if I haven't already overwhelmed you with information about Chopin, I can highly recommend these 3 books. There are many more available, and I listed these, I think, last week, and there are different ones on the book this week if you're going for the graduate level course. But for introductory level, I would say the Jeremy Seepman is probably the best. It's short, and it has both a biographical sketch and deals with all the music by genres. Like there's a little interlude about waltzes, an interlude about the mazurkas, etc. The Walker biography, Life and Times, is the best, newest biography. It's 700 pages, so complete, so carefully written, beautifully written, and the footnotes are fabulous. The footnotes are thrilling because you go off in these long sidebars about various people in his life and the actual events of what happened with that duel and what happened with that woman who had an affair with Liszt and what happened with the publisher. All the details are there. So that is a beautiful, complete book. And then the Chopin's piano book is written by a guy who did all the research on the Juan Bautza piano that was rented in Mallorca and what happened to that. Wanda Landowska bought it. Now realize Wanda Landowska was a Polish Jew who had to leave Berlin when the Nazis came to power, went to France, and then had to leave France and go to New York. And when she left France, her property was all seized and said, well, she abandoned it. She didn't want it, clearly. So they seized all her manuscripts and her antique instrument collection and this Juan Bautza piano, which has now disappeared because it was boxed up and sent on a train to Germany and has never been seen again. So that is an incredible detective story, and also has the whole history of the piano in World War II and the Jews and Wanda Landowska, and it's amazing. The one overreaching claim is In Search of the Instrument That Transformed Music. Not quite. Chopin had the preludes mostly written when they arrived in Mallorca. So this was just a working keyboard for him to keep working. I have one more piece I'd like to play for you, and I had to really think about whether or not I would do this. It's the Barcarolle. The Barcarolle is a late masterpiece. Maurice, the little devil who fired his Polish servant, also spoiled plans that Sand had made for them to go to Italy. She thought Chopin would recover. She was always trying to help take him to a warm place, not spend the winter in Paris. So she would help with all the finances. She arranged a trip. They would go to Italy for the whole winter and then come back to Nohant in the summer. So he would be continuously in a warm, sunny place for a year or 18 months. Maurice squelched the trip. He said, I don't want to go. I want to stay here, and no, I'm not going anywhere. And so she allowed him to determine the plans, because he was maybe 21 or 22 at that time. And she thought, well, he is becoming the man of the house, and maybe it is sensible after all. But Chopin had been looking forward to going to Italy his entire life. Remember when he left Warsaw the first time, he went to Vienna, and then he wanted to go to Italy. But he couldn't because there was revolutions and revolts happening all over the place, and his Polish friends had just retreated from Italy to come to Vienna. So he couldn't go. He never made it to Italy. But he wrote the Barcarolle after this trip was canceled. And it is the best example of when life gives you lemons, make limoncello. that brings us to the end. Now, it's up to you to follow through on listening. I want you to listen to some of these recordings. I've suggested there is a kind of a boxcar of barcarolles that some genius has put up on YouTube that has the musical score. You can follow the music and 5 wonderful pianists playing it one after another. So you can do your own comparative analysis of these different performances, and you'll hear it done much faster and with more polish than what I just did. But this is just an appetizer. I just want you to know this piece and to love it. And also there's a wonderful performance of the cello sonata, which is a final late piece that he wrote by Richter and Natalia Gutmann. It's an old YouTube, but it's a video, and they do the best job I've ever heard of the cello sonata. So good luck with your mission. I hope you keep listening and reading and enjoying and keeping Chopin's music alive.